Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Zelia Edgar. The aim of this show is to discuss all aspects of the paranormal, from the relatively mainstream to the downright bizarre, to pose questions and entertain ideas regarding every angle of the unexplained. So, hang on to your tinfoil hats, keep your hands and feet inside the saucer, and please, enjoy the ride. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce my guest. He's probably familiar to many of you, Steve Ward. Steve Ward has been fascinated by the unexplained for over half a century. There were two major events that inspired his interest in the unexplained. Growing up in Michigan, the March 1966 UFO flap occurred virtually in his backyard. The following November, a winged humanoid chased two couples down a lonely country road near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, and the legend of the Mothman was born. Steve would be chasing the Mothman for the rest of his life. Influenced primarily by John Keel and Jacques Vallée, his views on UFOs became unconventional and moved more towards a paranormal explanation. Steve's main area of research is what some call high strangeness or window areas, as Keel dubbed them, where disparate types of paranormal phenomena all seem to occur in the same location, and he believes that studying these paranormally active locations may be the key to understanding what the origin behind these manifestations are. He has his own podcast on this same network called The High Strangeness Factor, and he's also co-authoring a book which will be called Parallels and Patterns, a new paradigm for the study of paranormal phenomena. Well, Steve, welcome back to the show. Really excited to be talking with you today.
Well, Zelia, I'm pleased to be back. It's always a great time to talk to you about these subjects.
Nice. Yeah, well, I'm really looking forward to this show today. I guess we're kind of going to be focusing on the folkloric patterning found in current paranormal reports and kind of the connection to this long-standing tradition, which is something that I know we're both very interested in.
Yeah, let me start out with a question for you. Where was it that you first stumbled on the idea that various traditions of folklore might have some connection with modern-day UFO experiences?
You know, that's actually a great question, and I remember it super clearly. When I was a kid, I had these childcraft books, a whole collection of them from, I think, probably, I don't know, the 60s or 70s. And they were seriously like my favorite thing ever. The Story of the Sea had like the little section on myths and legends of the ocean. And then my absolute favorite one was the one that was specifically on myths and legends. And they had one of the Arthurian legends in there. And I wish I could remember the name exactly of it, but it was about a knight who went to the place of the fairies. And it was like this round stone place. And he passed 3 days there, and then he was like, I really have to get back and let everyone know I'm okay, but I'll be back. And so the fairy queen told him, okay, you can leave, but don't leave your horse. You can't leave your horse if you want to come back. And so he said, sure thing. Well, when he got out into the real world, of course, he saw, an old man, I think it was, who had fallen, and he, being a knight and very chivalrous, stepped off his horse to help him, and aged 300 years. So I read that when I was really little. Like I said, those were like my favorite books as a kid. And then it was some years later when I first started getting into, UFO lore, that I started noticing these bizarre patterns of missing time and how someone's like, well, it felt like 15 minutes, but it was actually 2 hours. And so that was probably in my mid to late teens that I realized, hey, you know what? He was taken into a UFO. Again, I was very much into the extraterrestrial theory at the time. But that was my first inkling that, this phenomenon is probably quite a bit older than what, a lot of people consider it to be, starting in mid-century America.
Well, that's interesting because you made the connection. In a sense, you weren't exactly doing research, but you made this connection anyway. For me, I was kind of spoon-fed with Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia. And people are going to have to forgive us a little bit, especially me, because I will be going over some of the same ground that there's certain areas you talk about, every time you're interviewed because they're sort of pivotal points. They're sort of the underpinnings of what we're talking about. And for me, my great awakening from the conventional UFOs or from other planets, and they still may be to a degree, was the John Keel's UFOs Operation Trojan Horse. And that that book was an eye opener for me, and I was not. I did not come along willingly at first. In fact, I think I've told this before. When I've been aware of John Keel and his book, Strange Creatures from Time and Space, which has been retitled The Guide to Mysterious Beings. That was the first book where he talked extensively about window areas, about these strange areas where these UFOs, cryptids, and so forth seem to pop in and pop out. And so I was prepared a little bit, but then Trojan Horse pulled all these different, seemingly different categories together: cryptids, UFOs, poltergeist phenomena. Now, to put this in perspective, this came out a few years before the Mothman prophecies. The events of the Mothman prophecies had happened much earlier, but it took a long time for Keel to get that book published. So I had just barely recovered from Trojan Horse, and that's when I stumbled onto Passport to Magonia, and that's where, of course, Jacques Vallée, who now Vallée is interesting because his first two books, and I read Challenge to Science. He had another one called Anatomy of a Phenomenon, and they both were looking at the UFO problem in a very realistic nuts and bolts aspect. In fact, the Challenge to Science was partly covered the waves in France in the early to mid 50s. And he was analyzing there were several landings in the classic egg-shaped craft. These entities were not grays. They were sort of slender, small, silver-suited aliens, but the reports were similar. The patterns were the same. So when he wrote Magonia, he starts out by saying, you can almost see these people. I mean, John Keel started out with the ET aspect, and Jacques Vallée did as well. But you can almost see these guys throwing up their hands and saying, something isn't right, something doesn't fit. And so he starts out by saying that about Magonia, that this is not a scientific book. So that's where I first came across the connection between in all the patterns, like you mentioned, the time loss, and there's so many other things that suggest that there is some kind of connection. So it's interesting that you kind of made the connection on your own. Me, I had to go to the source, the expert, to read about it and put it together.
Well, I'm sure reading The Complete Guide to Mysterious Beings at, the age of 8 or 9, something worked itself into my subconscious. So the credit goes to the spirit of the world or whatever.
Sounds good.
But yeah, no, I mean, it's funny because I know when I first came across Vallée actually in a collection of his interviews with J. Allen Hynek, The Edge of Reality. And so by then, he was already very much into the kind of folkloric side of things. So, I had read parts of that when I found Anatomy of a Phenomenon. And I remember I started reading it and thinking, is this actually the same guy? I actually double-checked it because it seemed very, very opposite what his later work was. And then, of course, I realized, this was written quite a bit earlier than the interviews took place. But you can see kind of how when people take an honest look at the phenomenon at large, the very hard and fast conventional theories just kind of lose traction, in my opinion, at least.
Well, there's been some other great researchers since Vallée. Now, also Jacques Vallée co-wrote another book with, Aubach, I believe his name is, another book that deals with these, sightings, strange anomalies, strange sightings from the past, and it's a sequel to Magonia, more or less. And I can't remember the name except it has Magonia in the title. Worth checking out. But another researcher, Joshua Kuchin, has written Thieves in the Night, and he has sort of picking up the mantle from Vallée and delved more and more into the connection between fairy folklore and modern day UFO experiences. And we'll get more and more into that. But one thing I want to state up front that I sometimes when you tell people about this, they think, well, okay, it's the same thing. It's aliens, but people were viewing them in a different context. back 100, 200 years ago. So, but when you analyze the reports, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be that people were really seeing these little beings with the green tunics and little red caps. And so there's something else. It goes more to, and I'm sure we'll get into this more. John Keel suggested that these things were possibly transmogrifications of energy. In other words, there's some kind of source, there's some kind of intelligence or energy or whatever it is that manifests in a certain way, but it actually takes on different forms. And I remember him writing that he was not, John Keel was not concerned so much with the what he called the facade. In other words, he didn't want to know if you saw a strange craft in the sky. He didn't care about the number of portholes or how fast it was going or the shape. If you saw a strange cryptid, a creature you couldn't identify, he wasn't even that concerned about what that looked like, because he thought the source was the same. So let's see, what was my brilliant point I'm going to with this? So the thing is that I suspect that modern day UFO pilots, beings, whatever they are not the same thing. They're not simply the fairies with different clothing. Okay, and I also don't think that the leprechauns or fairies of old were driving UFOs. It seems like there's and I don't know what it is. There's a common source, a third rail, or whatever you want to call it, where that we don't understand. It may be John Keel's transmogrification. It may be Carl Jung's collective unconscious somehow being manifest. But there is a deception going on. And I don't know if it's an intentional deception or if it's something maybe perhaps inherent in us where we just perceive things a certain way. Same source, same intelligence perhaps, but it for some reason, and you wrote your article for Alternate Perceptions magazine, knit caps and coveralls. I think I got that right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just that when we deal with these things, there are so many variations. It's exciting sometimes when you get a report of an entity or a craft that's virtually identical. It just almost never happens. I was going through, Albert Rosales has written, had this huge database of entities reports from 1 AD all the way up to the present. And he's published them in about 15 books or so. And in the first one, 1 AD to 1899, he's got this great encounter. It's November of 1896. There's Colonel E.J. Shaw, and he and a lady are driving home in their buggy in I think it's in California. Yeah, Stockton, California. And they encounter these 7-foot entities, but the encounter is sort of, their buggy stops. The suggestion is that the horses are terrified, but there's other encounters. We have vehicle stoppages, modern day vehicle stoppages, but then we have stoppages from the old days and just horse and buggy. But you get these entities were 7 foot tall. He said they didn't have any clothing on, but they seemed to have some kind of weird skin or fur or something, just bizarre. And this guy believed that he encountered Martians. Well, I guess I would too if I was in 1896, and maybe I had read. I'm not sure when H.G. Wells published War of the Worlds, but it's just the more you get into these reports and people try to put them in categories, there's just so little commonality that whole idea has to be dealt with somehow.
It's very true. I feel like especially with UFO entities, there's been a huge pull to try and categorize them into specific groups. Like, you have the Greys. I think typically it's the Greys, the Nordics, the Reptilians, and the Mantises. And the truth of it is that, well, maybe there are, quite a few that fit into these specific groups. there are countless that really don't, or that, if you ignore one part of the sighting, you might be able to shove it into, I don't know, the mantis box, but it's just still doesn't quite fit. And I feel like a lot of these entities as well, when you have people who go from experiencing a very classic UFO type encounter and then start having apparitions, other poltergeist type phenomena, it just becomes such a messy business to say, well, they were visited by aliens and then their house became haunted and there's no connection.
Right. There's one example, one of my favorites was covered by Elliot O'Donnell. Elliot O'Donnell wrote books around the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was probably one of the first paranormal investigators. And there's two aspects of this. There's we have something else we can talk about, how a group of people will see an object in the sky, but not everybody sees it. I mean, they're looking right in the area it's supposed to be, but not everybody perceives the same thing, suggesting that perhaps these aren't always physical craft. But this one incident brings everything together. It brings the fairies together and so forth. And this happened to one of Elliot O'Donnell's, an uncle by marriage, and it's near Limerick, Ireland. And he's traveling. He's got his servant, I love this, named Dunkley, who's driving the buggy. And it's night. It's on a road that's known to be haunted. And all of a sudden, the buggy lurches to a stop. And he's just identified as Mr. B, turns around and he looks, and the horse has stopped dead, like it's frozen almost. Poor Dunkley, has got a look of terror on his face, and he seems to be in a stupor where he can't move. Mr. B turns around. He's been sitting with his back to him, enjoying the night. He turns around, gets into the seat, and he looks around this cart, and he's seeing these little. He doesn't physically see an entity, but there's these little shadowy forms that are swarming around the cart. So he grabs the reins, breaks the spell. They take off and get some distance away. Dunkley comes out of his stupor, and he asked him, well, what happened? What did you see? Well, from his servant's perspective, they had come across a troupe of dancing fairies. Now, apparently, according to the lore, it's bad to come across the fairies when they're making merry. They don't like it, okay? So from his perspective, he saw these little guys with anger on their faces. They start to climb on the cart, and they're trying to pull him off. At least in his mind, that's going on. So interesting that you have a vehicle stoppage, so to speak. You have the small entities, and you have two people. This even happened with Betty and Barney Hill, the classic abduction case from the early 60s in New Hampshire, where they shared a similar experience, and much of it was the same when the way they reported it, but it wasn't exactly the same. So Dunkley saw the entities. Mr. B just saw these shadowy forms, but there was something there. Betty and Barney Hill, of course, who had the classic encounter, Route 3. Most people know this. Again, 1961, it was they were put under regressive hypnosis by Dr. Benjamin Simon. This was actually covered by the mainstream media. This was written up in Look magazine and given at least some credibility. And but I think one of them saw the faces of the aliens with kind of a Jimmy Durante nose. Now, I don't know, you kids out there, I don't know if you remember who Jimmy Durante was, but he had a prominent nose. The other saw that more as two slits. So it's interesting that there were some anomalies. There also, we talk about this Dunkley being in kind of a stupor. Well, Barney Hill was not conscious the whole time. He was, whereas Betty Hill was alert the whole time. So, and you find this pattern sometimes in other cases. Anyway, go on. There's another aspect of this we can get into, which actually I think perhaps connects it to fairy lore, and most people don't think of Betty and Barney Hill having anything to do with fairy lore. But if people remember the story Betty has developed this rapport with the one she calls the leader. And these guys, some people say that they're grays, but I take issue with that. They really don't look like grays. They look like, my analogy would be that if the Betty and Barney Hill aliens were to make a caricature of themselves, or perhaps an android of themselves, a much simpler form, that's what a gray might look like. So I don't really think of them as grays. And the grays hadn't really taken over in mass by that time with the reports. But she sees this book on board the UFO, and she's been having this conversation with the leader. And she asks him, "Can I take this with me?" And he says yes, and she's thrilled because it has strange writing in it. It has photographs in it, and at least she will know, even if people don't believe her, that this really happened. This is something significant. So, and then if we go to fairy folklore, you think of all the different situations where the stories where the hero or the adventurer sees an object. Maybe it's a gold ring or something, or a jewel, and they try to sneak it out of fairyland. Or maybe they're even given a gift to take out of fairyland. But once they get out, it vanishes or turns into a spider, or there's that certain motif where, you can't get them out. So when Betty and Barney Hill are about to leave, they're about to cross the threshold of the craft. The leader comes to her and says, "I'm sorry." The others object. "You can't have the book." And she's so upset. But you just can't get those things out of fairyland.
Yeah, I know Keel referred to it as the physical non-evidence in Trojan Horse, which I think it's absolutely perfect, because that's very common across, current UFO lore and the older fairy lore. I know even in A Trojan Feast, which is also by Joshua Cutchins, he talks about how so many of these old legends, they talk about how people will even, eat this delicious food in fairyland, which of course has its own share of really bad connotations, that you might be trapped there or forever bound to the fairies. But sometimes when they come out, they realize it was actually dirt or worms or dead leaves. There was just a case I read about, I think actually from Japan, a very old case where this boy claimed that he had been taken by, these people. And again, he was given rice cakes, which ended up being dirt or horse manure, I think. So it's weird how these, there is this common theme of things not being exactly what they seem.
Just make sure you don't go through a drive-through in fairyland.
Jeez, no kidding. No, but way back to people seeing different things. There was this fantastic case from Jenny Randall's amazing book, Mind Monsters, which was a more recent case. I think it may have been from the 80s, of these 3 kids, 15-year-olds, who were out looking for UFOs. And instead, they saw this bizarre vapor or mist rise from a nearby watercourse and form into this donut-shaped blob. And apparently 2 of them realized that it was this kind of Sasquatch-like creature that had claws and, strangely enough, no legs. It almost sounds like a Casper the Ghost type looking thing. And, they were just absolutely running away from it. But the third friend, who was closest, called after him. He was like, "What's wrong with you guys?" All he saw was a cloud. So, again, it is not even just with UFOs and fairies. You have this Sasquatch-like apparition that 2 of 3 people saw was some sort of beast, and the one that was closest and in, I guess, most danger, if we're actually believing that there was any danger involved, only saw a cloud.
The same thing in haunted houses. People will see a what that looks like a real entity, maybe even the full apparition, and others simply see the mist, or they'll see it, they'll photograph it, and they'll just get the mist.
Yeah, it's just bizarre.
Paul Devereaux talks about something called Proto Entities, and he gives in one of his books he's got a couple of them that start out, they're called Earthlights. This one deals more with UFOs, but he talks about situations where the light, the what appears to be the craft or whatever, and the entity seem to be one and the same. It talks about how these lights manifest, and then the entity seems to manifest. There was a case in Australia, I think, where several people saw this globe, sort of a blue orb, not terribly big, but then when they looked inside, they could see this humanoid entity inside. And when one of them went back to seek it out later, it reformed again, and he could see in this globe, he could see there were the darker parts that formed, and then they became this entity, and the entity was blurry at first, but then phased in. And I've heard several instances where people will see a ball of light or an orb, and there's some kind of entity in there, almost as if it's giving birth somehow or manifesting. And it makes me wonder. I mentioned Keel earlier. Keel talked a lot about this idea of these things being temporal, paraphysical, and he even, I think you mentioned that in the Eighth Tower, which was a follow-up to the Mothman prophecies, he talks about that perhaps these things have a certain existence and then melt away. He even thought that they might actually operate as real creatures for a while, stalk and kill livestock and consume them, and then sort of fade away. But it makes you wonder if this idea of these proto entities and the instance you mentioned before where they saw the mist, if these things are occasionally, if people actually see these things manifesting into their temporal form. I know that's way out there. We should tell people that we're on the speculation train today. We're not. This isn't hard science by any means.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, by the way, I absolutely love that part in the Eighth Tower, because I think he ends the chapter with, what if these poor slobs actually melt? And I get such a kick out of that. But no, that was something that I actually did want to bring up, because I just did quite a bit of research on the Rochdale, Indiana creature, which, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is a very bizarre case of this kind of spectral Bigfoot-like creature, which occurred in Rochdale, Indiana in August of 1972. It was observed by about 50 people, and it had a lot of high strangeness involved. And the weirdest thing that I had noticed about it is that when the phenomenon first started up, first of all, there was actually a UFO, which appeared to, well, we'd call it a UFO. There was a light in the sky that appeared to explode. The person who saw it actually thought that a plane had blown up, but no evidence was found. There were no traces at the scene. And then immediately thereafter, a particular family started to be harassed by this thing that looked like about a 6 foot tall, ape-like creature, except that it was translucent and it would leave no tracks when it walked over mud. They said that it was like it didn't touch anything when it, was in the area. It would bang on their house. It sounded almost like poltergeist type phenomenon. But then, as the days go by, another family observes it, and they say that not only is it an absolutely physical creature, it trampled their fence, it trampled weeds when it ran by, they could hear it running, it also killed over 100 of their chickens, and this is common across lots of UFO stuff, drained their blood. And so you have this thing which starts out as a specter, then it becomes very physical and, enacts a physical effect on these chickens. It drains their blood. And then when it left again, it was impervious to bullets. And they said that it made no noise, almost returning to this kind of spectral-like, existence. And it's just bizarre how you can almost see that arc, from spectral to physical to spectral again, almost like it is temporal and passing through.
Could be that John Keel was just ahead of his time, as so many have been coming to recognize. I know that Ted Phillips was associated with MUFON for years. He was and associated with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and we're talking about the real Dr. J. Allen Hynek, not the fictional action hero character that we saw recently on Project Blue Book. But I won't dwell on that. But Ted Phillips was known for investigating thousands of trace landing cases, what they call the close encounters of the second kind, where a craft leaves a radiation burn or a landing marks or burn marks in the trees or whatever, some kind of physical evidence. Well, he uncovered a place he dubbed Marley Woods, which is in southwest Missouri, I believe. And it's the first time he was able to actually observe phenomena there, light phenomena and so forth. But there were a lot of other things going on. People were having encounters and missing time. And although he said that the manifestations of the UFOs seemed to be shifting somewhat from the classic saucer shape to more smaller light anomalies, they were also cryptid. Somebody saw these like large white dogs with longish hair. and they took a shot at it, and he could see blood. I mean, it hit it, and he could see red blood. And when they went to the area, they did allegedly they got some of these hairs and tested them, and they couldn't figure out what it was. But these things vanished. I mean, if it was real, if the story's true, they were gone. Let me give you another instance that may go along with John Keel, and may because if Keel's on the right track with these ideas of these things are manifest somehow. And we need to get into the reflective nature of this phenomenon. But if Keel's right, then this ties right into folklore, various traditions of folklore, and modern day UFO reports. That would give us an idea of why these things have a similar pattern. This could possibly explain if these things simply manifest due to some kind of laws we don't understand, then this might begin to explain why we have these patterns between various traditions of folklore and modern day UFO experiences. Okay, people will remember classic Art Bell. I remember back when he would have on Colm Kelleher and George Knapp, and of course they're the two gentlemen that wrote The Hunt for the Skinwalker, talking about the Skinwalker Ranch, also known as the Sherman Ranch, the Bigelow Ranch, and now somebody else has it in northeast Utah. And that's where all these different very high strangeness events were going on. Well, they used to we used to get some. I invite people to try and find some of these old shows because they were so entertaining. But we would get these tantalizing bits of some of the stories about what was going on. And one of the classic stories was where these two observers, one of them had a pair of night vision goggles. They're on a ridge on the Skinwalker Ranch, just doing a classic night vigil. They were part of the National Institute of Discovery Science that Bob Bigelow established. Bob Bigelow bought the ranch from Sherman when he started having all these bizarre events, strange creatures, cattle mutilations, and so forth. So anyway, they're standing, and of course there was a recent TV show on that as well. So they're standing a vigil, and one of them, I mean, they can see this faint light, but the guy with the night vision goggles, it looks a little more like a tunnel, and he's watching, and he sees something that looks like it's crawling out of it. Now, I've just revisited it, listening to the book on Audible, because I missed this. This thing is like using its elbows to come through some kind of a tunnel. Suspended tunnel. It's very dark, so they can't see detail very well. But this thing comes out, and it's sort of has the physical size and bulk of a Bigfoot. But this guy is insistent that it had no face, and it was hairless. And then it walks off into the night. Well, I thought, again, wild speculation. But was this something being manifested? Was it crawling through this this birth canal, this transmogrification birth canal? I bet you nobody's ever said that before. And walked off into the night. But it hadn't. If people remember the great film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the 1956 edition, where the people were being copied by the seed pods. And the early stages, there wasn't any detail. No, the face was like a rubber stamp where it could become anything. So I just wondered if perhaps they actually saw something where this thing, whatever mechanism, whatever it was coming from, was something that just hadn't quite formed completely, and was as it walked off into the night, it perhaps grew hair, perhaps retained some kind of facial features, and became more of a real being.
I'm going to remind everyone real quick that you are listening to Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And today we are visiting with Steve Ward. No, that's something that I have definitely entertained as well. And I think that Keel, too, he actually cited this belief specifically with demonic forces and potentially the jinn, that in order to kind of become able to enact change upon this world and to move through this plane of existence, they would actually take, corporeal stuff, whether it was eating roadkill or corpses, to kind of somehow infuse their non-corporeal body with physical material. And I think it's interesting because even if, a lot of these beliefs are not meant specifically to be taken literally, but it's interesting to see the proximity of, massive mutilations, animals drained of blood in the location of some of these bizarre cryptid encounters.
There definitely is a negative side or a dark side to some of this. The animal mutilations are just bizarre. And there was that one incident on the Skinwalker Ranch where there was the mother and the new calf had been born, and they weren't very far away. It was daylight. They were on the other side of a rise. Sherman's dog took off all of a sudden, and they went over there and they found out that the calf was horribly mutilated. I'm not even going into the description of it. There were times when in the snow, they would see the footprints of a calf that had started running, and the footprints were getting further apart as if it was going faster and faster. Then all of a sudden it stops dead, implying that it was somehow picked up or perhaps went into some kind of other portal somewhere. I have never been able to wrap my head around any kind of now certainly some of the animal mutilation mystery does seem to be wrapped up with the government somehow, and that doesn't make any sense either. I mean, if they need to test cattle for some reason in a clandestine manner, why don't they just start their own cattle ranch, But it's another really, and that night, a couple nights later, Colin Kelleher and Sherman and some of the other people as part of the NIDS team, they tracked some strange creatures. They could barely see them in the dark. The dogs were reacting strangely. They saw this thing up in the tree where they could see the eye shine, and took a couple shots at it. Sherman he hit it, and it hit the ground, but they couldn't find anything more than one footprint. It's just they're just a mass of contradictions. It just we try to. The human mind tries to make sense of these things and tries to put it in a logical context, but there's so much of this that is just elusive and really escapes. But there are other the high strangeness spots. Another one of my favorite ones is David Wales in 1977. This was sort of a head-on collision between if you look at some aspects of this, if you look at some certain aspects of the Skinwalker Ranch, and I invite people to read The Hunt for the Skinwalker, and if you look at some aspects of there's a great book by Randolph Pugh and F.W. Holliday on the Dove Enigma. There's other books on that same area too, but if you isolate certain things, it's easy to say, oh, look, this is E.T. These are visitors from other planets or perhaps some other dimension. But when you start to look at these things as a whole, as you and I have done, and because we have been influenced or infected by John Keel, we can't help but notice the level of high strangeness and how all these things seem to connect together. In David Wales, they were seeing the classic egg-shaped craft. There were people seeing these 7-foot-tall entities. In their context, they would say they looked like they were in boiler suits. So it's some kind of silver suit, sometimes with a helmet, sometimes not. But there was also an incident where a young lady named Carolyn, Pugh and Holliday interviewed, the only people they report on are people they interviewed one-on-one. And they were in, I forget the name of the family, but the family had seen some UFOs up close. They were interviewing them. And as so often happens, they finally get around to the young children. And Carolyn, who's about 12 years old, turns out she saw something strange one morning. And it was a bright light that woke her up. It's classic. She goes and looks outside the window and sees this egg-shaped craft. And then she steps back because standing on the windowsill is not a 7-foot silver-footed giant. It's a 3-foot entity with slanted eyebrows and a curved nose. He's wearing kind of like the same silver suit, but this little guy is like something out of Darby O'Gill and the Little People, And she saw another incident where she saw these guys kind of walking or floating on the air. Around the same time, a gentleman named Cyril John, 64-year-old pensioner, he's waiting for the retirement people bus to go on a trip early that morning. He's awakened by this flashing light. He looks outside, sees the classic egg-shaped object, and sort of floating or standing next to it is one of these 7-foot giants, not tethered to this thing, but just sort of defying gravity. And there's the hatch is open, and this thing is just floating next to it. Eventually, it kind of drifts over the top of his house where you can't see it anymore. So, and there's other there's so many other things we can get into. Just one other quick one. There's something they used to call elf disease, and that's where you would get this kind of a weird skin rash or dermatological condition. Well, some of the people that these silver-suited entities, the 7-foot ones, were seen sometimes in broad daylight during this time period in Dyfed, Wales. And some people that were in close proximity with these entities developed some kind of a weird skin rash. Now, obviously, we can't say with any certainty that's the same thing. But, and again, I should point out, I think it's Catherine Briggs, in one of her books she's done encyclopedias on fairy lore, points out that the fairies were not necessarily small beings. They could be any size. So, whether we're dealing with like the giants, the giant trolls or goblins or whatever, or the small fairies, gnomes, dwarves, etc., the suggestion is that these might be coming from the same source.
And I know that we have discussed this many times on multiple shows, but yeah, for the sake of, any new listeners out there, fairies are not necessarily the cute little Tinkerbell type, tiny people with wings that, kind of pop culture today views them as. In many ways, they encompass, I would say, almost as broad a spectrum as our current, entirety of the paranormal, from the very good and helpful benevolent ones, which could be in tune with the Nordics of UFO lore, or the visions of the Blessed Virgin in a lot of religious and occult systems, to things that are more in line with Sasquatch-like creatures, to things that kind of seem to be a lot more evil or malevolent, like the Greys or the Mantises. I mean, there is so much tied in with this one specific belief system.
Yes, and there's, I know we're going all over the place, but there are so many, and you can even pull in like the demonic lore. When you talk about, witches were supposed to have had contact with the demons. Well, sometimes the demons looked like what we think of as modern day Men in Black, wearing black suits and black hats. Men in Black, of course, are call it modern day folklore, if you will, or call them government agents or sneaky UFO beings telling people not to report their UFO encounter. That's a whole other subject. But the demons, sometimes they didn't have any vocal cords, so when they would hear their voices, they would be just sort of like voices out in thin air. Well, there are some UFO reports similar to that. I think it's Gary Wilcox, probably, I don't know if it's 60s or 70s. He encountered some entities that I think spoke German. Man, you just get you. It's very hard to categorize these things when you have such a wide variety of experience. But he didn't hear, it wasn't telepathy, he said. It was like he heard their voices kind of separate from them. Now, I'm not suggesting that these German-speaking entities were demons, but again, you get these strange patterns. There was a case in the 60s in France. These young children saw this sort of a globe-shaped craft land, and the entities were little guys, little dark entities were flying around. They had webbed feet. There was the smell of sulfur, fire and brimstone, which is so brimstone is the smell of sulfur, and is always associated with the manifestation of demons, or at least was in the past. And so you get this. And again, I could go on. There's the bells, church bells, were a ring because supposedly the demonic entities, the devil, it would just dispel them or keep them away. There's a really, really bizarre case in Sweden, I think, and I can't pick out the date, probably the 60s, where these two men, there's a landing of a craft, these entities come out and try to grab them. They're almost like blobs. So I don't know if these were supposed to be blob-like aliens or if they were in some kind of a suit or garment. But they had grabbed them. They're trying to pull them toward the craft. And one of them runs and lays on gets loose, runs and lays on the horn of the car. And immediately these things disengage. And again, I don't know if we can, when you look at these things, when you get enough of these things, you think, well, heck, maybe there is a connection. On the other hand, we always have to be careful because, you can start, you get to the point where you may have to wear a tinfoil hat, like the name of your show, to try and put off some of these things.
Oh man, I know. I just sometimes when I try to imagine, all of the connections with this stuff, I just think of a giant room with little Post-it notes on the wall connected by string, because there are so many connections that can be drawn. Because even laying on the horn, exactly what disengaged Momo, the Missouri monster, from the initial attack of two young women in 1971 who were picnicking. It was, it appeared suddenly as they were sitting aside, I think, a river, eating lunch. They went into the car, they left the keys outside though, so they couldn't leave, and it was actually trying to get into the car. And when one of the witnesses laid on the horn was when it jumped back. So, I mean, it's weird too how, we have this similar response to a similar thing. I mean, and then...
Animal responses, dogs reacting to being afraid to go outside, that sort of thing, running away. That's another aspect.
Yeah. What do you think? Something that I've noticed specifically with a lot of cryptids, but also every now and again, with fairy and UFO lore, what is their thing with dogs? Because, in the case of Momo, he appeared with a dead dog. The Mothman, there was that big dead dog beside the road in the infamous mallet encounter, I think it was. And, in many of these cases, dogs do behave very... strangely around some of these encounters. It's something that always stands out when I see it.
Conversely, there have been some cases, I think Stan Gordon covered them when he covered the strange Bigfoot/UFO encounters in Pennsylvania, southwestern Pennsylvania in 73 and 74. I think there were some cases where the dogs didn't react at all. It was just as bizarre. But normally there's quite a strong reaction. I think perhaps, if these things are real, to any aspect, dogs are those things that alert people to their presence, or could even be, there people have said that don't send your dog after a Bigfoot. Don't tell them to go sick the Bigfoot because the Bigfoot will kill the dog. So perhaps it's simply a matter of dogs being an alert system or a warning system where these entities, if they have any reality or any intelligence at all, that might be the first thing they would want to destroy or kill to try to prevent them from being known about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I know I always think too about Keel going into that one farmer's field that had all those purple lights around it. And then the farmer was like, "Oh, we don't go down there because I've lost, several dogs in that area." And then too, wasn't there a case at Skinwalker Ranch where their dogs chased after one of these lights or one of these creatures? I don't remember which it was, and burst.
Yes,
into
they
flame.
were George Knapp said there were these bluish globes, and they got to the point where they would call them the blue meanies, and they were always kind of present. And that we heard other things about orange orbs too, but these were bluish orbs, and they showed up. They were freaking out, Sherman and his wife, and the dogs would obey him. So unfortunately, he got to the point one time where he was just sort of at his wit's end, and he sicked the dogs after them. And what they were doing, these orbs were almost like playing with the dogs. The dogs would jump up and snap at them, and they would just kind of pull out of sight, just like a mean kid, And so the orbs took off. the dogs followed them, and then they were gone. And then the next day, he found essentially what looks like the dogs were incinerated, or something just awful happened to them. So again, another real negative aspect. And that's just it. There's the other thing about these areas where if you isolate certain parts, it could be ET or whatever. If you look at the whole spectrum, it doesn't seem to be that. But the other aspect is there is not just a negative, but it's a very tricksterish aspect to this. I mean, the Shermans, they heard these strange disembodied voices, like just over their heads in another language. They would have objects go missing. Sherman had his post hole digger. It was right behind him. He turns around, it was gone. He thought one of the kids were playing a prank on him. It turned up weeks later, way up in a tree, a heavy post hole digger. So there's this aspect, this sort of juvenile, nasty aspect to some of these things that suggest that there's something far beyond some kind of an intelligence that is beyond ours. It's something childish and nasty sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, and the misplacement of objects, that is classic haunting type phenomena. But combined,
you talked about the fairies and how they can be very, they weren't benign little Tinkerbells. And that was true with the fairies too. They called them the good people because they didn't want to incur their wrath. Because they could be nasty little guys.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when I realized that, because of course when I started looking into fairy lore, I would see all of these, different phrases for them. And I was like, because I knew that most of the lore, most of it is not what we would exactly call benevolent. I would say that a good portion of it is malevolent, and an even better portion of it is just kind of meaningless, which, you'll see a lot too in current UFO lore, where there are messages passed that just, they really, lead to nothing. And so I started seeing the names from, the good people, the good folk, the gentry, and I was like, it doesn't seem to fit. And then I did read that it was all euphemisms so that, you wouldn't offend them. I don't know what people would have liked to have called them, but I'm sure it wasn't nearly as nice.
You don't want to offend. You try not to offend the mob, is what they were trying to do. Yeah. But they would get them somehow anyway.
Yeah, I know that's the interesting thing. Really quick, because I know we have about 10 minutes left on the show, and there's so much I want to cover yet. So I guess we'll just have to go ahead and do a part 2.
Sounds good.
But one thing I'd like to bring up real quick, something that I've noticed just again throughout fairy lore and especially throughout UFO lore. What is the deal with the little black boxes? As we're talking about disembodied voices and different languages being spoken, there have been tons of accounts of especially UFO occupants who carry this little black box, or sometimes it's like a wand of some sort. And then you go back into fairy lore and they talk about how they'll carry, a certain gem, or again, the wand type object. It's one of those uncanny things that really does kind of stick around throughout these encounters.
I just wonder if it's maybe it's sort of a catch-all. Of course, sometimes these objects cause people to be paralyzed temporarily, but I wonder if it's simply we always talk about high technology, and we call it the black box because we don't know what's in it. We don't know how it works. Perhaps maybe that's what the motif is. It's we don't know what it is or how it works, and perhaps it doesn't matter. It's just something that exists for whatever purpose and does what it does, but there's no real, mechanism or internal reality to it, if that makes any sense. But this is it's a common theme. There's a crazy story. A guy, his name, Joseph Ferrier, who used to be a radio personality out east, talked about how he, and I don't know if the story is true or not, but he seemed to be on the level. When he was a kid, he was hitchhiking, and these people picked him up. These people looked kind of like Hollywood types. They were just very, very nice-looking people. They gave him a ride. In the back seat are all these little black boxes, and he asked him about them, and he said, "Well, we place them in different parts of your planet, because they're somehow they were beneficial. And so years later, now, again, I don't know what to make of this, but there was a contactee named Howard Menger. He was kind of like the East Coast George Adamski. George Adamski supposedly contacted Venusians in California in 51, I think. Menger, in the all through his life, was supposed to have been contacted by these long-haired Venusians. Okay, and he's on the East Coast. Well, there was a meeting, he used to have these great meetings where people would congregate. There's a classic photograph from one of those meetings of this guy that's supposed to be Valiant Thor, who's a Venusian,
oh boy,
and some of his entourage are there. Very, very nice-looking, photogenic people. Well, Ferrier said that years later, he looked at this photograph, and the couple that was with this Valiant Thor was the spitting image of the people that gave him the ride. Now, I don't know what to make of that. It's a great story, even if it's not true. But again, you wonder, Zelia, if sometimes maybe it doesn't matter if there's a real physical reality to some of this. There's sort of this, oh God, I don't know, this, I hate to use the collective unconsciousness, but there are these continual motif, these things that just show up, even though and maybe some of them are kind of fanciful. Maybe people have gilded the lily a little bit, but there's the same things show up, whether there's a real physicality to them or whether it's something more elusive or more ethereal. I don't know. But yeah, it's very, I just wonder if the black box idea is just that maybe the intelligence doesn't know what it is either. Mm-hmm. So the MacGuffin, it sort of manifests as a black box so that we can imprint on it whatever, or they can imprint on it whatever they need to at that time for whatever they're manifesting at that time.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, too, even if you look at it in terms of symbols, in my opinion, currently the black box, it's the ultimate symbol of the unknown, of information, that we
that's good.
just don't have yet. But I suppose I can't believe, I'm telling you, it's been missing time this past whole hour. As we're drawing close to the end of this episode, just to tease the next one, I know I really want to get into one of those recurring symbols, which I'm doing a little bit of research on recently, and that is that of the black shuck, the black dog, hellhound.
Oh, yes.
That's something that I think I'd really like to get into in our next episode, which, when this one's released, will be in 2 weeks' time. But so yeah, if you want to direct people to your fantastic podcast on this same network and anything else you're doing.
Yes, on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, the High Strangeness Factor. And if you can't get enough of Zelia and I, Zelia is often a co-host on my show and sometimes a guest. And it's on every other week. We alternate weeks, so you'll never be without a quality podcast. And of course, there are many other podcasts on the same network. You can also hear me weekly as a correspondent on Mac Maloney's Military X-Files on the same network and on many other networks. I'm working on a book which will be out not soon, so I won't even tease that right now. But I'm also working on some other writing projects which will manifest eventually. And if you want to follow me, you can find me on Facebook, Steve Ward. And usually if you type in Battle Creek, you'll find the correct Steve Ward. So, Zelia, this has been, I can't believe how fast I know it's a cliche, but this has zoomed by as it always does when you and I have conversations on or off the air.
Oh, I know. This has been like crazy fast. So thank you again. I've had a fantastic time talking about all of this crazy stuff today.
And who else can you talk about this weird stuff with? Have to get to a convention or whatever, because otherwise people look at you like, okay, I need to go check the air on my tires.
They just haven't been welcomed into the Church of John Keel yet.
That's right. That's right.
Alrighty. Well, once again, I would really like to thank my guest, Steve Ward, for a fascinating conversation tonight. I would also like to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson, the people in charge here at the Paranormal UK Radio Network. And a thank you, too, to John Hutchinson for composing my intro and outro music. With all that said, if you enjoyed this program, you can catch new episodes every other Monday on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, and go ahead and check out my YouTube channel, also called Just Another Tinfoil Hat. Again, this has been Just Another Tinfoil Hat, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, And I am Zelia Edgar, signing off.